Cyril Ramaphosa was sworn in for a second term as South Africa's president, hailing the Government of National Unity deal as the beginning of a new era. So how will the ANC and its chief coalition partner, the Democratic Alliance, bridge the ideological divide in order to govern together? And how will the new government address the many challenges facing the nation? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The ANC's dismal performance in the 2024 general election means it's only the second time in 30 years that a multi-party government will lead the country. Before we begin our discussion, my colleague Caroline B brings us more.
South Africa's democracy began under a government of national unity after Nelson Mandela's African National Congress secured an outright win in the first multiracial election in 1994. As soon as the constitution was in place, the ANC took over the reins with alliance partners the South African Communist Party and the Congress of Trade Unions, COSATU.
Things were sensitive, but we were all very hopeful and we were hoping to build a new country. And that's why that happened. It was supposed to last for like 5 years, but then the new constitution came in 1996. And so you'll know that the National Party at the time actually abandoned and left, but then it didn't quite matter because then the new constitution was in.
The party that freed South Africa from the racial system of apartheid enjoyed uncontested rule for nearly 3 decades. After losing substantial ground in the recent general election, it now finds itself in uncharted territory and has to share power with other parties.
The key thing, I think, for navigating where they are is to actually agree on certain key policy principles. And I think 3 among them should be, look, the state of the economy in South Africa is not great. If anything, I think we're quite in turmoil. Regional inequality, you kind of see it with places like KZN, Eastern Cape, where infrastructure is falling apart. And then also the problem of corruption within government.
We want relief for the poor. We want jobs, the youth to, also skills, skills development for the youth. We want that. And we want all the good things that we've always wanted for the people. We want houses to be built, things that need to be fixed like Eskom, Transnet. We need to get rid of that load shedding.
Caroline B, CGTN.
And we're now going to unpack South Africa's new era. Joining us from Johannesburg, Professor Alan Hirsch, professor at the UCT Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance and a research fellow and leader of the Migration Governance Reform Program at the New South Institute. From Cape Town, Leonard Mbule Nziege, researcher at the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa at the University of Cape Town. And from Makhanda, Eastern Cape, Dr. Tapelo Salapedi, a politics lecturer at Rhodes University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. And that is where I want to start our conversation today. President Cyril Ramaphosa was sworn in for a second term in office. He announced that South Africa has begun a new era. Of course, that is what most governments say at the beginning of any new term. But let me start off with you, Leonard. What is your understanding or interpretation of that statement?
Thank you for having me on air, Beatrice. Yes, a new era with the current political dispensation underscores that the South Africa is trying to turn its back from the previous decade of mismanagement, of corruption, sluggish economic growth. The country has experienced average 0.8% economic growth over the last decade. Unemployment, which is now over 32% and even upwards of 60% amongst the youth. The new era is trying to usher in a period whereby the country is able to overcome these circumstances. Crime, load shedding, even regular water cuts in Gauteng province have been some of the vices which have been experienced for the past few years and which led to or contributed significantly to the ANC experiencing this dismal performance in the last election. So President Ramaphosa, speaking to the new era, is trying to usher in a new period wherein the country will no longer be confronted with those challenges.
Professor Hirsch, your take?
Yes, well, of course I agree with those points, but, it is a new era in another way as well. it's a new regime. I mean, political scientists would call it a new regime. The structure of power in the new government is going to be different. The ANC doesn't have a majority. The DA is quite an important force, and now quite a number of other parties have come into it. So it basically dislodges the existing sort of constraints on action. I think it's a new era in a way that could be problematic, or it could open up possibilities for change that were very difficult when the ANC had a large majority.
Dr. Selepedi.
Okay, no, I mean, I agree with the speakers. I just think one thing that we need to take into consideration is the issue around the public-private relationship. So corporate South Africa and the ANC government. And I think for a very long time, since the 1994 inception, there hasn't been a strong relationship between corporate South Africa and South African government broad. And I think they need to consolidate or strengthen that relationship so that there can be sort of public-private investments into infrastructure, into education, into health. And I think health is going to obviously be a big one when it comes to the national health insurance. But we'll obviously have to go and see what will be the DA's position on that as well inside the GNU. But I think if they're able to look at those sort of relationship, at least between private sector and public power, I think they would go a long way in terms of ensuring that a lot of issues, whether energy, whether infrastructure, are then resolved.
Professor Hirsch, you do allude to the issue that partners could be problematic, but this is not the first time that South Africa is being governed by a government of national unity, or GNU. Nelson Mandela first formed a GNU 1994, 1997. How does the GNU of 2024 compare with the GNU of 1994?
Well, it is actually very different. So in 1994, President Mandela had a majority of the seats in parliament and a majority of the cabinet ministers. And there was a principle of sufficient consensus to a large extent. Not everybody necessarily agreed with all the decisions taken in cabinet. The situation now is that to a significant extent, the other parties have much more power. And if the other parties decided to ally, for example, with the parties that are not represented in the government of national unity to block something that the ANC is doing, they could do that. So that wasn't something that they could do in 1994 because the ANC had a significant majority in parliament.
So, Leonard, clarify this for us, because President Ramaphosa will be guiding, a government of national unity that really doesn't have a majority. How challenging is this going to be? How will this impact governance in South Africa?
Yes, it's a new political dispensation, as the previous speakers have alluded to. And in order to prevent a repeat of what has happened at the local levels, that is at the municipal councils, wherein government, where mixed cabinets, coalition governments have led to a lot of instability, there have been put in place a basic minimum program as well as a statement of intent, that is a brush of guidelines which help to coordinate how these parties will go about with government action. So, for example, common principles which have been adhered to, which have been agreed upon, include improving state capacity, stabilizing governance, promoting inclusive growth, fighting poverty, pursuing inclusive growth. There's a guideline with respect to how these parties will go about, so that at least there is consensus going forward. There's also put in place a political council as well as dispute resolution mechanisms, because they understand that there is a novel political framework, and now there needs to be put in place mechanisms in order that all the parties are aligned, they're going in one direction, and even in the event that there are disagreements, there are measures which can address that.
So, Dr. Selepedi, of course, these parties have different ideological thinking here, because the Democratic Alliance, for instance, and the Inkatha Freedom Party have now both joined the GNU with the ANC. How did the ANC, first of all, get together with the Democratic Alliance?
My understanding is that the ANC designed the document of intent that was to organize themselves with other political parties that participated in this year's elections, to come up with a set of agreements or basic agreements that would guide one, the principles of the parties in that GNU, and then look at what are the issues bedeviling South Africa, and then what then would be the modalities. And in that context, the DA came first as party to that intent, the document, and subsequent to that, EFF and other political parties. So, of course, the founding of that document was by the ANC, and then the DA came thereafter. And as a result of that, of course, it is not a situation, as we've had this discussion in South Africa, where then the DA is able to decide which political party forms part of the document of intent. It's really a decision by the ANC and other political parties forming part of that. And I think it was important to sort of clarify, given at least the public discussions that have been taking place in South Africa around who are the founding members of that intent document.
So we'll stay with that for the moment, Professor Hirsch, because I want to get a bit of an understanding here about the core political ideologies of the ANC and the DA and exactly what will be the agenda here.
Okay, so the DA has for a long time been a centre-right party, which it's a liberal party, so liberal on social issues, liberal on economic issues, favours the free market or a relatively free market, and prefers government not to get too involved in the economy. I mean, there's a blurred lines there, but that's the way they lean. The ANC in the past was quite broad, so it ranged from traditionalists on the conservative right to radicals on the left. The Communist Party is still part of an agreement with the ANC, but essentially today the ANC is a social democratic party, which means it's a democratic party, but it believes the state has a role to play in supporting the economic development, but also in providing welfare for the poor, and that's a big issue in South Africa. I should just mention that on that issue, the DA agrees with the ANC. The DA already made a commitment before the elections that it wouldn't undermine the social service provisions. But there will be economic issues in particular, I think, that they will differ on, and foreign policy issues.
We did see the markets, Professor Hirsch, we did see the markets rallying rather well at the announcement of a GNU for South Africa. But looking also at the performance of the last election, the DA appears to have really gained influence over the years. How did it do this?
Well, if you look at the numbers, the DA got slightly less number of votes and slightly less proportion of the votes this time. They were over 22% last time, they're slightly under 22% this time. But they do have, I was listening to a Vox Pop on another TV station, and they do seem to have convinced a lot of South Africans that they are good at governing. In the Western Cape, where they have led the provincial government for a long time, there's a sense that in many respects, not in all respects, in health, in the infrastructure, but not in education really, but in many respects the DA has done very well in terms of the quality of management of the area, and I think that's what will make people somewhat sympathetic to the DA, even if they don't agree with their economic ideology.
Dr. Selepedi, the DA pursuing a more free market ideology, the ANC more social leaning. What political and policy shifts do we expect at home and abroad based on the government of national unity, given their ideological, political ideology?
Look, it's hard to sort of anticipate what shifts there may be that may come, but I don't anticipate that there will be foreign policy shifts. I think the South Africa's foreign policy is going to stay as it is, especially when we are looking at Russia and Ukraine, whether we're looking at BRICS or China itself or Iran. I think that's going to remain, and I think the ANC is going to ensure that ministerial posts are not those specific ministerial posts are not going to be given to the DA or any other political party. And I think that also goes to, in my view, broadly the security cluster within cabinet as well, and other sort of strategic ministerial posts. So foreign policy, I don't think that will be taken away. I think what's going to be a bit difficult. Oh, by the way, let me just mention that I know that the DA is also looking for the Minister of Communications, digital space as well, the eye in that. But the big issue is going to be health, and I think it's also going to be around energy, especially the issues around Eskom and bundling. So those may be sticking points for the DA. I think there's very little to sort of see what common ground there may be between the ANC and the DA, but I'm sure they will find common ground that will be characterized by them making compromises on both sides. And just remember that both the DA and the ANC, at least different pockets of the ANC, are understanding of coalitions. Whether you look at Cape Town when it first emerged under President Thabo Mbeki, and the Nelson Mandela Bay, obviously there were coalitions again between the DA and the ANC there. So the ANC is not new to coalitions, and I think there's an understanding that there has to be compromise on both sides as you move policy or you implement these policies.
All right, gentlemen, we are going to take a short break now, and when we return, we will continue unpacking South Africa's new era. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Professor Alan Hirsch, Leonard Mbulenziege, and Dr. Tapelo Salapedi. Before the break, we looked at South Africa's historic new era of governance. Let's now take a look at how the new government can address some of South Africa's pressing issues. Well, President Ramaphosa, during his inauguration speech, warned that unless South Africa addressed deep inequalities, the country would become unstable. So what should be the key priorities, policy priorities of the GNU to address the most pressing issues facing South Africa today? Let me start off with you, Leonard.
Yes, I mean, he spoke to inequality. According to the World Bank Gini coefficient, South Africa has a score of 0.67, which is the highest amongst the world. I live in Cape Town, and it's a tale of two worlds. Sometimes when you work from one suburb and then you find yourself in a township, and the conditions are very different for South African citizens. That being said, stabilizing the state, for example, the state-owned enterprises like Eskom, the state-owned electricity corporation. In 2023, we had 289 days of power outages. That can't continue. That needs to be, addressed with immediate effect. Transit, the state logistics company, it's also in shambles. So those are big issues that need to be addressed, because now, without those two companies operating at full potential, the economy can't go forward. The level of education, human capital development. South Africa has only 6% of the population with university degrees. And the major reason to that is because the basic education system does not equip students with the skills allowing them to get to that level. And even so, those who are able to get out of the high school system, even if they don't want to go to university, they don't have enough skills to insert themselves in the labor market. So that's one of the reasons why we have high youth unemployment. So those are just some of the issues which need to be addressed very dramatically.
Professor Hirsch, what are some of the issues you think should be priority for the GNU?
Well, there are major issues in social services. I mentioned education earlier, but for me the biggest issue is actually crime and personal safety. And also personal safety for people, especially for women and children, is really compromised. I think it'll make a really big difference to the confidence that businesses have in South Africa if we're able to reduce crime levels. The other critical issue, I think, that will help to change a lot of things is to improve the quality of the public service. The public service is uneven. There's some sections of the public service that are very good, but there's some that are very poor, and particularly some of the municipalities are very poorly led in terms of the senior officials. And we really need to get better quality people into senior positions in all levels of government relatively quickly, if possible, although it's not that easy.
Dr. Sipeledi, your view?
I agree with the speakers. If I might just add, the issue of corruption, I agree, especially the syndicates in the construction sector in KZN or in the different provinces in the country. That's quite crucial to deal away with. Second, and I agree with the Prof when you talked about public service, specifically municipalities, but here specifically talking about ensuring that money does not just go out and it's mishandled or it's misappropriated and it's not redirected in the areas where it should, i.e. also infrastructure, especially in small municipalities where I'm staying. So I think those are crucial factors, I think. Then obviously the big elephant in the room is Eskom, or generally, energy infrastructure, whether it's going to be the renewal lobby or the coal lobby. I think all of those things need to be consolidated as to where South Africa is looking to go when it comes to energy. I think for me, those, agreeing with everybody else, those are the sort of three priorities that I think the GNU government would need to look into.
Well, Lena, we have looked at some of the key priorities and the challenges that probably are facing South Africa today. But given the fact that these are parties with different ideologies and different approaches, how do you see the GNU addressing them?
As I spoke to earlier, there is a statement of intent, and they've spoken about the need to pursue consensus because, as the president highlighted, it's a new era and there's a new political dispensation. We saw that the voter turnout was the lowest since the founding democratic elections in 1994, and they understand that the public is depending on them to be very decisive to carry out all these objectives with respect to improving their livelihoods. So we have the national political dialogue, which is supposed to take place sometime after the cabinet is announced. And I think from there, we're going to have a lot more clarity with respect to, how decision making is going to be pursued, what are the main policy actions which are going to be formulated, as well as the individuals who are going to be tasked with leading the country to pursue the facets that I just made mention of.
Right. So I want to get your view here, because President Ramaphosa also noted that the South African public had expressed their disappointment and disapproval of our performance in some of the areas in which we have failed, and that is what he said during the inauguration. So, Professor Hirsch, let me start off with you here. Do you see the GNU, though, gaining public trust, especially those disillusioned with the system, as shown in the election result?
I think there are two things that will help. The one is that if the GNU doesn't rush, and I think the previous speaker mentioned that, doesn't rush into decisions and commitments and policies, but rather there's a process of engagement between the people from the different political parties, and possibly with experts in those areas as well that are more neutral and can provide some sort of facilitation in those conversations, that will be really helpful. But it's very necessary to explain the process to the people. So I think there has to be very, very good communication between the new government and the population, especially in the first few months, to explain that building a sound coalition between the political parties and having sound policies isn't easy, and it takes a little bit of time.
Dr. Selepedi.
I think what this moment does is to open for South Africa the possibility of moving away from partisan politics. If political parties in the GNU are able to build bridges across the political divide, for me that will be the clincher. That you are not ideologically straitjacketed into the National Democratic Revolution on the part of the ANC, or the sort of market-centered development societies characterized by the DA, and so on with the EFF and PA. I think if they can centralize what are the important issues in South Africa and how can we all move together in a pragmatic manner, I think really that would usher in a moment where political parties and leadership move beyond partisan politics. That would be important. If they're not able to do that, then we're going to see a lot of rambling around coalitions or this GNU.
Right. I want to get your final thoughts here, and if I may go first to Professor Hirsch here, because we've talked about this being a new dispensation. It may have its challenges. There are opportunities. If you can point out to us the opportunities in this government of national unity, as well as what you see as the future of South Africa. What do you see in the future of South Africa under the GNU?
Well, I'm optimistic at this point. You know, I spoke to some of the parliamentarians and former ministers when I was lucky enough to be able to attend the presidential inauguration on Wednesday. And from both the two main parties, I got a feeling that they really were committed to building that kind of non-partisan kind of approach to solving problems. I think that some of the key issues are going to be the things that are opened up. We have a national health insurance program that has been legislated, but there still seem to be some sort of edges that need to be ironed out. There's a lot of disagreement outside of the ruling party and possibly inside the ruling party as well. And you know, I think that this opens up the possibility for fine-tuning the national health insurance. It opens up the possibility for fine-tuning the policies on the state-owned enterprises, although that has been going much better in the last year or so than it was before. And it opens the possibility for also engaging with the very thorny issue of black economic empowerment, which in many respects has been successful, but in some respects has given the ANC and BEE a bad name because it looks like it's favors for pals. And if they can rejig the system, that it really does empower black professionals and black business people, I think that will be a fantastic reform.
Right, Dr. Tselebi, your view.
Okay. Look, well, I'm excited. I think, like I said earlier on, it does. If political leadership has the ability to bridge the political divide, it would be good. And I think for me, it would be interesting to see what private economic players will do in terms of their investment money, because private sector in South Africa or corporate South Africa holds quite a lot of money in their banks or in their pockets, and not necessarily has been funding a lot of infrastructure projects or projects that are really of national importance. So for me, it would be to see what these other political parties bring in terms of capital investment. But I think it's an important moment. This had to happen. I think coalitions was necessary. It's going to be difficult, one must add, of course, but I think if they're able to cross the political divide, it would be a good thing.
Leonard, very briefly, your final thoughts.
Pan-African posted, Afrobarometer did a pre-election survey. 83% of South Africans think that the country is going in the wrong direction. We had the same messaging about a new era during Ramaphosa's first term with the New Dawn, and things went completely sideways. So I think South Africans are looking to, this GNU as a new dispensation that will, ignite hope. But then I'm also trying to see how it's going to consolidate democracy, because we're speaking about the GNU, but what about the opposition? We have the MK party, which came out of nowhere and is asserting itself as a political player, the EFF and others. How are they going to be able to control government action? How are they going to keep the government accountable? What is going to happen with respect to the the next local elections? Is there going to be is there going to be more competitive at the local level as well? So I am looking towards the opportunities with respect to how the political landscape can become more competitive, more fragmented, and how actors are going to react to that, not only from within the GNU, but also in the opposition.
All right, gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining us in this discussion. But that's all for this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Professor Alan Hirsch, a professor at UCT Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance and a research fellow and leader of the Migration Governance Reform Program at the New South Institute. Leonard Mbule Nziege, researcher at the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa at the University of Cape Town, and Dr. Tapelo Tasaledi, politics lecturer at Rhodes University. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X, and you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.